This is the Apollo 8 Earthrise photograph, taken by NASA astronaut Bill Anders on Christmas Eve, 1968. It's been described as the most influential environmental photograph ever taken, and its appearance has been heralded as the genesis of the environmental movement. In the winter of 1965, writer Stuart Brand had an LSD experience on a rooftop overlooking San Francisco, where he felt he could perceive the curvature of the Earth. This in turn made him wonder why nobody had taken a photograph of the Earth from space yet. Brand then embarked on a spirited campaign, selling badges stating, "Why haven't we seen a photograph of the whole Earth from space yet?" selling them for $25 each and sending them to Congress and NASA. He felt that the release of such a photograph would encourage people to live more conscientiously in relation to the planet. Who knows to what degree Brand's campaign influenced NASA to snap this photograph a few years later. Many of the astronauts that view the Earth from space undergo a profound cognitive shift known as the overview effect, which can be described as a view of profound unity, planetary unity and interconnection, and the desire to protect the planet. A similar perspective shift can be reliably induced via experiences with psychedelic substances. Both the science of ecology, which is my background, and the experience of psychedelics give one direct knowledge of this interconnection. This is a planet in crisis. We are currently undergoing a 6th mass extinction event due entirely to human actions on the biosphere. This ongoing ecological crisis seems to stem in part from a crisis of human connection. It is unfortunate that humans seem to be becoming ever more disconnected from each other and the natural world. Recent surveys have found that, on average, UK children spend less time outside than prison inmates and are better able to identify Pokemon characters than common wildlife species. For all that the World Wide Web has created, our screen obsessions render us prisoners of the paradox that the more we watch, the less we see of the world around us. What happens when we forget the smell of the sea, the feel of the grass, the bite of the wind on our cheeks? When we fall out of love with nature, we can bear its destruction. When we destroy our own home, on some level, do we fall out of love with ourselves? A disconnection with nature is just one aspect of depression, but one that has important implications for our species and the biosphere. Ongoing ecological destruction can be considered to be directly linked to this human-nature disconnect. It seems if there was some form of catalyst that could reliably facilitate human-nature connection, it could be of immense value. It turns out such catalysts exist and have in fact been used by some humans for centuries or even millennia. Recent research has highlighted how psychedelic substances can markedly increase people's feelings of nature connection. The great chemist and discoverer of LSD and psilocybin, Albert Hofmann, described profound childhood experiences of nature connection and oneness. Later reporting his subsequent experience of LSD produced very similar feelings of unity and interconnection with the natural world. One survey of 150 people with psychedelic experience found that all of them reported an increase in their nature connection, with 66% stating their environmental concern had increased. Through a change in attitude, positive changes in environmental proactive behavior were reported in over half the sample, with 16% of people even going as far to change careers following their psychedelic use. Of all the psychedelics examined, increased nature connectors was most commonly associated with use of psilocybin mushrooms. This is some very fresh, currently unpublished survey data shared by colleagues of the Psychedelic Research Group at Imperial College London. These novel and very compelling findings show that people's nature-relatedness, or connection, is very strongly predicted by the amount of past use of classical psychedelics. From the same data set, it was found that people who relate below average for nature-relatedness showed a significant increase in this trait following psychedelic use. Degree of change in nature-relatedness was also correlated with well-being post-psychedelic. Of all the psychedelics examined, the bulk of the research showing a link between an increase in nature connection and psychedelics has been with psilocybin. Psilocybin mushrooms have a long history of human use, being used by some Mexican indigenous groups for centuries in healing rituals. And there is increasing scientific evidence to show they may be promising treatments for a number of psychiatric disorders. In a trial conducted at Imperial College, exploring the potential of psilocybin as a treatment for severe depression, of 20 people, 17 benefited from the psilocybin therapy. And at a 6-month follow-up, all reported a renewed sense of connectedness. It's interesting to note that none of these people, prior to their psilocybin sessions, reported feeling disconnected from nature. They only noticed the importance of this connection following their experience. Even among healthy, non-depressed people, psilocybin can increase level of nature connection. In one study, over a third of people reported enduring positive changes in their relationship to the environment 6 to 18 months after their experience. Psilocybin was used in a strictly controlled and monitored environment in these studies. It is interesting to note that a long-term increase in nature connection was frequently observed despite the clinical setting. This image from the Beckley Foundation Imperial College Research Program shows a representation of the increased interconnectivity of the brain under a high dose of psilocybin compared to placebo as measured via MRI. Under psilocybin, a brain network called the default mode network, which is a fundamental component of the neural basis of the ego, becomes relaxed and deactivated. And this allows for an increase in brain communication, creating a more unified, interconnected brain. The psychedelic ego dissolution experience seems to be the mechanism through which perceived boundaries between self and other dissolve, catalyzing an expanded perspective of self-nature overlap. A rigid ego seems to play an important part in both depression and nature disconnection. When egoic separateness walls us off in private prisons and disconnects us from the world around us, it makes sense that we would not feel a burning responsibility for nature or a desire to protect it. And yet, an increase in interconnectedness, a feeling of being part of nature, appears to be a primary facet of the psychedelic experience, described time and time again in user experience reports, in research surveys, and in key early historical accounts of psychedelic experiences. That's not to say that psychedelics are necessary to connect with nature. To do that, you've got to get into it. Our species has spent almost its entire existence living in natural environments for which our physiology is adapted. Direct physical sensory exposure to nature has been shown to increase nature connectedness, while leading to a decrease in anxiety and an increase in well-being. Exposure to nature acts as a potent health tonic and buffer. It leads to marked reductions in stress, decreased levels of depression and anxiety, increased resilience and pro-social behavior, elevated self-esteem, and an enhanced capacity for engagement and learning in children and adolescents. In a recent meta-analysis, pooling data from 143 studies, totaling 290 million participants from 20 countries, time in nature was associated with significant health benefits. These included a reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, premature death, preterm birth, reduced levels of stress, high blood pressure, and cholesterol. Even in small doses, nature can be restorative. Recent researchers find that even 5 minutes in nature is sufficient to boost mood, while a mere half hour spent in nature over the course of a week is sufficient to lower blood pressure and depression. Being in nature naturally puts one into a mindful state, which itself has been linked to antidepressant and anti-anxiety effects. And it can also decrease rumination by quietening activity in the default mode network of the brain. Tribal indigenous cultures tend to live more ecologically sustainable and individualistic lives than Western civilized people. The Huichol Indians of Mexico are the most culturally intact, ancient, indigenous psychedelic-using people on Earth. As well as a deep reverence for nature, they have more of a collective identity and a deep bond to their land. It is interesting that their long tradition of using the peyote cactus as a sacrament seems linked to their high levels of nature connectedness. Perhaps their psychedelically enhanced nature connectedness has allowed them to not just love their natural habitat, but also passionately protect it. And we can see this nature protective attitude in other areas. In a recent study, it was found that population-level lifetime use of classical psychedelics, as opposed to other consumed substances, was associated with pro-environmental and ecological behavior due to an increase in nature-relatedness. This suggests psychedelic usage could have benefits at the societal level at a time when more and more species are becoming extinct every day. As a gathering of eco-psychologists stated at a conference almost 30 years ago, if the self is expanded to include the world, behavior leading to the destruction of the world will be experienced as self-destruction. What if, rather than vilifying these compounds, we held them in the same high regard that some indigenous cultures do? How different might our global future look if that were the case? Any means through which humans can better identify and connect with nature, to increase awareness and acceptance of their ecological self, should be considered of utmost importance. And identifying any factors that can facilitate and enhance this process should be considered a very important human endeavor. As Albert Hofmann himself so eloquently put it, a year before his death, at the mighty age of 101, alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the great living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. It is the causative reason for ecological devastation and climate change. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers for this. To ensure preservation and survival of the biosphere, we require a fundamental psychological shift. We need to transcend our sense of separateness and urgently regain our connection to nature. I can't think of anything more important. Thank you.